everyone, and welcome to Workplace Therapy, a weekly podcast where we explore how we work together and how we heal together. My name is Sarah Gould, and I'm the VP of Learning and Development at Unity & Company. We're a consulting firm that specializes in leadership development and employee engagement. On top of that, I'm also the CEO and founder of my own consulting firm, Sarah Gould Consulting, where I focus on individuals and small business to optimize for success. Joining me today are my co-hosts, Scott, who is our CEO of Unity & Company, and Skylar, who serves as our Director of Special Programs. Today, we're going to be wrapping up a two-part series on how discovering our strengths has changed our outlook, not just in life, but also at work. Last week, Skylar did a great job of walking us through her strengths profile. And today, Scott, it's your turn to be on this hot seat. Are you ready?
Let's do this.
Scott, why don't you start by telling us what your top 5 strengths are, and maybe give us a couple of sentences about how each strength manifests for you specifically.
Awesome. Yeah, happy to, Sarah. So I mentioned this in the last episode, but what's interesting to me is I've actually taken StrengthsFinder multiple times. They'd recommend that you don't do that or that it's not necessary to do that. And with Skylar, that definitely seemed to be true, where she's taken it 2 times, once for business school and once as part of my team when we originally started working with each other. And her strengths profile basically didn't change, even though she was taking the assessment at 2 very different points in her life. For me, the story's been a little bit different. Like I've actually taken StrengthsFinder intentionally or unintentionally at least once with every new role that I've taken on, like over the last 10 to 15 years. Right. So I first took it when I was early career working for a financial services company. I took it again pre-business school. I took it again when I started my own business 10 years ago. Then I've had about 6 jobs that I've taken in the startup space over the last decade where I've taken StrengthsFinder at least once, because I do it as a kind of assimilation tool whenever I'm taking over a new team or building a new team. I use it as a way to kind of like get all of our leaders aligned. And so one of the things that I've noticed is that I've taken it multiple times, and of the top 5 results that you get, 3 of mine are almost always like anchored in place. Like those things seem to be like hardwired into like my DNA. No matter what is going on in my life, those 3 things are going to be 3 things. Right. And that's strategic, achiever, and relator. I never not have those things. And we'll talk about what that means in a sec. And then there are 2 skills that I call like flex strengths, where they change every time like I have a role, like they kind of rotate in and out of my life in the top 5. But the thing that I've realized is that the 2 things that flex in and out, they're almost always in my top 10. So it's not like they're not strengths. They're just not always in my top 5. And the ones that rotate into my top 5 are there because there's something about what I'm faced with in the imminent future that requires me to flex like a new skill set, right? So, when I first started my own business 10 years ago, I took on a business partner. It was just me and him, and he wasn't particularly analytical. And I have the ability to be analytical. It just takes a little bit more mental horsepower from me, and so it's like number 10 or something in my stack rank. And so when I was working with him, analytical was like one of my top 5 strengths, but it has never reappeared since because in other roles, I had analysts reporting to me. And so like, I didn't need to like do the heavy lifting there. Right. And so it's almost like something in my subconscious or my whole conscious was just like, I'm good. Someone else has got this for me, which is interesting. So all of that lead up to say the top 5 I'm about to share with you is my most recent top 5. And the backdrop of that top 5 is these are the strengths, or this is the assessment that was produced right as I was leaving my career in corporate America and made the decision to start my own business. So you got to picture Scott leaving the nest of corporate America with all of the security and, certainty, well, relative certainty that comes with that, and like entering the world of entrepreneurship and like not really like understanding fully like the path in front of me at that time. All right. So the first top strength, strategic. So this is like everybody's strengths profiles also read a little bit differently depending on how you answer the assessment. So like Skylar mentioned that we have one strength that is the same between the two of us. But if you read the actual analysis of that strength, the way that hers reads could read very differently from me, right? So just because you have the same strength doesn't mean it manifests in exactly the same way. So like strategic is one of those words that has a lot of baggage kind of around it because it's not really well defined, right? So the particular version of the strategic strength that applies to me is the ability to sort through the clutter and find the best route, right? So it's making sense of the complicated. So one of the attributes that really resonated to me in my strengths results was that you excel at gaming out the what if scenarios, which is so true. Like when I start like almost to a fault, right, Sarah? Because like this is where actually you're in my relationship is so advantageous because you have this skill of just like locking a decision and fucking just pummeling through walls and launching things at like MVP. And like your first week in business, you did more shit than I did in like my first like quarter in business. And I'm like, God damn, like that's pretty impressive. But that's the difference between us. And so when you coach me, that's a lot of what it's about. It's about like getting out of your head, just getting your shit out there. Like don't incubate forever. Right. And then Skylar gives me like the opposite impact, right? Which is she's like, let's be more thoughtful about this. Like, let's like, but it's like, that's, I think why the Unity team is such a great team,
That's
is
true.
because like we kind of push and pull on each other. And it's great. So, another thing they said about the strategic skill is your MO is what if, select what you're going to do, and then strike. Right. So I spend a lot of time in the what if stage, but then once I select, it's selected and it's going to get done. And then you strike, so that's strategic. Individualization. So this is the one I think we share, right, Skylar? Individualization.
Yep.
Okay. So for me, this strength toward individualization is really it is the aha that StrengthsFinder facilitated. So I found StrengthsFinder probably 3 or 4 years before I met Skylar. So I'd used it a couple of times as a leader. And I got to tell you, it just completely rocked my world, right? Because I think I've told this story before in a podcast I did with Monica, but like I was, so my parents were Asian immigrants. So they immigrated to the United States from the Philippines. And I realized this is not unique to Asian households, but it is common amongst Asian households where there is an emphasis on academic achievement. Right. And it really comes from a great place of Asian parents wanting to make sure that their kids are set up and self-sufficient in the world, can get good jobs where they're not like worried about financial or job security. So that's where my parents were coming from. But the way that it manifested upon me at the time was there was an expectation that like, if you had the intellectual horsepower to get straight A's, you should get straight A's, regardless of the cost. And so what that meant in practice is there are some classes it was really easy for me to get an A. And there are some classes where I had to work my ass off to memorize certain things. Like I still didn't understand them, but I knew how to answer the questions correctly on a test and get an A, right? But it hasn't stuck with me to this day. And so I got the straight A's and that was great, but I walked through those formative years of my life not really knowing how my strengths were differentiated, meaning what strengths came easy to me and what strengths came hard to me, because the expectation was you'd be good at everything. And the expectation was you would mitigate your weaknesses. Like that's the entire thing. You get straight A's by mitigating your weaknesses, right? And so it created discipline and focus and a well-roundedness for sure. But it also created some baggage for me around the idea of constantly chipping away at your weaknesses, becoming well-rounded, becoming, a generalist that is like equally good at everything. And I think those people, I think this is why like a lot of straight A students make really good middle managers, but not a lot of them become visionary CEOs or entrepreneurs that actually like change the world in a significant way. Like more often, those are the college dropouts, right? That change the world in a significant way because they're unencumbered by this idea of being good at everything. And they instead lean into this idea of like, I have a deep passion around this one thing. And by hook or by crook, that shit's going to get done, Yeah. And so that was something I had to kind of like break myself out of. So individualization, it really just came out of this whole Strengths Finder epiphany moment that I had, which like the Strengths Finder mantra is like, you can't be anything you want to be. I mean, full stop. Let's just stop there. Like how many of us have been told in this culture, especially in, American culture, which is all about rugged individualism. Somebody say this word for me. Rugged individualism. Rugged individualism. Okay. Yeah. Especially in this culture, which is all about the individual, right? We're told that we can be whatever it is that we want to be. And in reality, it's like you can't. But what StrengthsFinder can say is you can't be whatever you want to be, but you can be a whole lot more of what you already are. And the way that you do that is by understanding the natural strengths that you have and leaning into those strengths, right? So the story I always tell is like, Michael Phelps, like I think to this day, he's still the most decorated Olympian ever, right? In swimming. And the guy is like tall, has a lean physique, really athletic. He could probably do whatever sport he wanted to do. But I contend to you that Michael Phelps only becomes Michael Phelps. He only becomes the most decorated Olympian ever if he discovers that his strength is swimming and he leans into that exclusively, right? If he was like, I'm going to do swimming and basketball and baseball and football and soccer, right? And I'm going to take all these other things that I'm not as naturally gifted at, but I'm going to try to be passable at all of these other sports. You could probably do it. He's got the build, but he's not going to be overwhelmingly successful unless he finds swimming because he's like literally built for that, right? And we understand this when it comes to physical limitations. Like we understand that like Kevin Hart is never going to be a player in the NBA,
Right.
Because there are physical limitations that prevent him from doing that. And he found his niche though in comedy. And like now he's phenomenal and like, a force to be reckoned with in comedy. But what if he leaned into something that wasn't his strength? Right? Like he wouldn't be nearly as successful as he is. So anyway, long way around. That's what individualization really is. StrengthsFinder taught me that. And like my world just kind of like opened up where it's like, I felt unencumbered by the need to be equally good at everything, unencumbered by the need to take things that are just naturally a struggle for me and hammer away at them incessantly versus just leaning into strengths. And what individualization as a theme means is it means that I am now looking for ways to pay that forward in others, where I'm looking for what makes you unique as an individual, right? And instead of passing judgment on it because it's not the way that I would do things, I'm fascinated by it. Like Skylar and I are so different, but I am constantly fascinated and in awe by the things that she brings to the table because the way that she gets to conclusions is very different than the way that I get to conclusions. And I need that like in my life.
And I just want to say here that the individualization was something that I think was like your biggest management strength because it could have been easily, you had a team of very diverse people at the first job when I was on your team. And we all had very, very different strengths. And you could have been pitting us against each other and trying to make us all this one version of success. And we could have hated each other for it. And what you really did was like got us together and said each one of us brings a different strength to the table. And I think that was like what made you such a good manager, and like everybody loved you as a manager, and that's exactly the reason why. So you didn't just do it for yourself, but like you do help other people see that like their individual and uniqueness matters.
Oh, thank you. Oh, you're making me think about that team, and every time I do, I just like I want to talk about y'all forever. It's that was one of the most special and privileged moments of my career was leading that team because of how different y'all were and how much you leaned into each other in spite of your differences. It's like the pinnacle of like what I think workplace teams could be and should be. All right, I'm moving on. Achiever. So this, I think, is my Asian DNA refusing to be decoupled from new Scott or Scott 2.0. So the achiever DNA is the constant need for achievement. I have to achieve something tangible to feel good about myself. There's a quote in my strengths profile that says, "You learn to live with the constant whisper of discontent." And it's so true. Like I don't know if it's a whisper. I think there's somebody actually shouting at me at the end of every day. It's like, you didn't do enough. Like, where's your gold star for today? So anyway, so that's something I have to constantly try to keep in check. So there's a shadow side, not resting, avoiding self-care, being too sacrificial or responsible.
Mm-hmm.
And this is actually something I'm working a lot with my therapist about, is that I have a very narrow view of what achievement kind of looks like, right? And often it does involve being sacrificial, kind of giving of myself and, in favor of my kids and my wife and my team and my job and stuff like that. And then forgetting things like, meditation and, therapy and relaxation. And for me, playing music is like a creative outlet that I just pressed pause on for years. And because I didn't feel like it had a tangible impact. That's another thing about achiever. You have to have tangible achievements every day. And because the benefit of playing music wasn't tangible to me, I deprioritized it for a long time. And it wasn't until I deleted it from my life for like 10 years and then started doing it again that I realized, no, it actually is tangible. It's just tangible in ways I didn't previously appreciate. Like when I play music, I have more bandwidth. I see more hope and more possibility. It's like I'm communicating in a different language that interfaces directly with my soul, and that has value. But like the other parts of my achiever strength don't want to acknowledge that as value. So it's like a constant like inner conflict.
Well, and it sounds like Scott, with the achiever part of your profile, that's reinforced by your K-12 education that you had, where
probably
it was like a very linear quantitative measure of achievement. And if that was your measure of success in your formative years, meaning like even just the way your executive functioning was developed inside of your brain from a neurological perspective, this reinforces it. So it's like you're having to butt against nature, how you show up. It's a natural strength, and the way it was nurtured inside of that K-12 education. So it's even harder to come out of it. So I just want to acknowledge that you recognizing that music is an achievement and is something that's positive and meaningful and contributes to your well-being and makes you better. That I would imagine would be a very difficult thing to recognize, but the most important thing to recognize.
I think that's such a solid observation. I think that's right on the nose. Thank you, doctor. I appreciate that.
You're welcome.
All right. I'm going to boogie because again, I'm verbally processing through this interview. Maximizer. All right. So what a maximizer is, it's very closely related to achiever. So maximizer is about, it's about the level of which I like to achieve. So one of the excerpts from the profile is that excellence, not average, is your measure of success. And again, Sarah, like this is where you helped me tremendously, because it's like, it's okay to strive for excellence. But if you're striving for 100% in everything you put out, you're never going to put anything out, right? Some things you need to launch MVP, and you can achieve excellence over time, but keeping it incubated is just going to hold you back, right? So this is a strength in that I have high standards and I know how to get high standards. And when I'm leading teams, I push my teams to high standards. But I also expect my teams to push back and say, Scott, how about for V1? Like, what do we do for V1? What do we do to hit this date? And that's where I have the most successful teams, is like teams that can keep that tension in check. So another thing with Maximizer is I'm fascinated by other people's strengths, and I feel the need to nurture and refine them, which is, you both have worked with me in that capacity in the past. And so I think you know this about me, but really I think the root of that motivation is that like, it's gratitude. Right. It's like I said, StrengthsFinder set me free from the paradigms that I was living under before and helped me to enter the rest of my career with a lot more confidence that I don't have to be good at everything and I don't have to have all the right answers. I just have to have a command of the things I'm naturally good at. And that's enough. And I'm just so grateful for the weight that lifted off of my shoulders, that I feel the need to pay that forward. Right. And I had mentors who helped me to develop and cultivate that. And I know that not everybody has those. And so I seek to be that mentor when I can be, when there's a right fit. So that's really Maximizer, is my desire to do that. And then Relator, Relator is another one that's my anchor skill. It's always there. And it's really just a tendency to form fewer relationships, but have those relationships be deeper and more intimate. One of the things that was interesting about the strengths profile was that it's riskier to be a relator, right? Because you let people in enough to hurt you significantly. But it's also much more rewarding to be a relator. And so like, I do think about that sometimes, about the risk of just how much I love the few people who I've allowed into my circle and how vulnerable that makes me. But honestly, I don't think I'd have it any other way. So,
yeah. So I know you touched on it a little bit, but when you first initially got these results, that first time you took it, were there things that you were like, absolutely, that's me right away? And then conversely, were there things that kind of took you a while to process and really realize that that's a strength for you?
Yeah. So strategic was one that took me a while, because it was kind of like in every corporate culture, there are these buzzwords that people use as a very non-specific way of holding you down. Right. And like, professional presence, like that's one of them. It's like, what does that even like mean? You're not a culture fit. What does that mean? Like that one's even more dangerous, right? And like, you're not strategic enough. Like that's another one where it's like, I think it gets wielded against people, especially like earlier in their career when they're in more junior level roles and they don't necessarily have access to the wider view of like what's going on. All strategy is the ability to see the forest for the trees, to see the landscape, to like see around corners, anticipate things coming up. And like really what feeds into strategy is like deductive thinking and your vantage point, right? Like if you're on the ground level, your vantage point is on the ground. So if you're talking to an individual contributor about strategy, their strategic perspective is going to be limited to the lens they have access to. But if you put that individual contributor on a mountaintop and you ask them to survey the battlefield, they'll come to different conclusions just by virtue of where you put them, right? And so strategic for me didn't resonate initially because early in my career, when I was on the front lines or like a first level line manager, that was feedback that I got. It's like, you're not strategic enough. And like, strategy was a function of vantage point and time coupled with deductive reasoning, right? And I didn't have any of those yet. So it wasn't that I wasn't strategic or didn't have the capability to be strategic. It's just that the expectations and how they were verbalized to me in the workplace wasn't really calibrated to my level or tenure, right? And so my encouragement to leaders that are out there is if you're coaching your direct reports to be strategic, make sure that it's calibrated to their vantage point and their level of tenure and their level of context. Because all of those things you can give them. You can give them a higher vantage point. You can bring them to higher level meetings, right? You can talk them through the high level dependencies, right? Time will fix itself. Context you can go get by reading everything in sight, like Skylar. So Skylar, accelerated her propensity towards strategy by just brute forcing information into her brain, which I think is a great way to do that. So anyway, strategic didn't resonate with me at first, but now that I have all those things, now that I've climbed my way up to higher vantage points, now that I have a lot more time under my belt, now that I am not a first level individual contributor, I can see how my natural predisposition towards strategy has helped me in my life and my previous roles. Individualization and relator make total sense to me. Achiever and maximizer, they make sense. I just don't like that they're there. They're like what I'm working through in therapy. So I think what I need to work on really is how to capitalize the things that make those things good without making them crippling, because they have significant shadow sides.
I think for maximizer, I can definitely see that in you. And I see it in two different ways, because I think for yourself, you're so hard on yourself. The maximizer for yourself is if you're not first, you're last. And that's how you view maximizer for yourself. But how you view maximizer for me is oh, look at all these great qualities that she has. Let me do the best way. How can I best support her to get her to the top, wherever that may be? It doesn't even matter what the top is. And so I think it's maybe turning the maximizer that you have of yourself and instead and using it for the one that you have for other people.
Retweet.
Oh my God. Monica tells me stuff like that all the time. When I'm agonizing over whether I should do something for myself, or I bought a guitar for myself recently. And, I felt so bad because I have a bunch of them already. And then I was I felt I didn't earn it. I haven't practiced enough. I haven't played music in a long time. And I just felt so bad. And I was agonizing over it for 2 weeks. And Monica was if this was for anybody else in the family, you would do it and not even blink. But because it's for you, just stop talking about it and go do it, And I'm are you sure? And it was rough, but I appreciate that perspective, Skylar. I think I know that intuitively. It's just really hard. It's just really hard for me, probably because of how hardwired these are. So it's a great example of how I think StrengthsFinder is mind-blowingly freeing, but also can give you insight into areas in your life where the strength side and the liability side are more closely related than you'd want to admit,
Right. So when you think about how you understand and how you've interpreted these strengths over the years and how they've evolved, how do you think it's impacted how you show up to work?
I think the way that it's impacted how I show up at work is a few things, right? So the first thing is I do think that there was a period in my life where I was overly prone to categorizing things in right and wrong, correct and incorrect, right? And because I had been trained to mitigate my weaknesses my entire life,
right?
My expectation was that everybody else would mitigate their weaknesses. And if everybody else mitigated their weaknesses and everybody else developed their strengths to a comparable level, then what would happen is everybody would look essentially the same. So like the opposite of individualization was my whole worldview. Like that was the goal. It's like get everybody to a similar level of competence so that you can deploy them with complete fungibility. They're all replaceable cogs in the wheel, right? And then you can deploy them wherever you want. You just give them the job description and it's just like, do you have the experience to do that job description? Go do that job description, right? Like that's how naively I thought, right, when I first entered the workforce. And what StrengthsFinder did for me was it helped me to realize, no, we're built differently. Like we all have natural gifts and predispositions. And because I was like in operations, I was already in operations at the time, and I was in Six Sigma training, which was all about like efficiency optimization, right? So the piece of StrengthsFinder that was able to penetrate my heart at the time was this idea of how much more efficient would it be if you leaned into the things that you were naturally gifted at versus spent an inordinate amount of time pursuing, fixing the things that you're not strong at, right? And I was like, oh my gosh, efficiency. Like I'm so foolish. It's like, so that's what it took to really kind of like get into my brain. But that was the first aha in a cascading set of ahas that completely changed the way that I thought about leadership, because now I'm free not to think about people as fungible cogs in a machine. I'm free to think about people in terms of their natural and unique contributions and what they are best at and what is the best and highest use of that person. And like, how can we help that person to navigate to increasingly higher and higher levels of contribution, because then everybody wins. Like the business wins because you've got this person that's growing in engagement and competency, and they're providing value-added insights, and they're innovating and driving change and productivity. And at the same time, they're making more money, they're getting higher titles, they're developing themselves, they feel good about their capabilities. Everybody wins, right? If you think about things in context of strengths. So I think like that has helped me to just gain a better appreciation of what individuals bring to the table. And on the flip side, what it does is it helps you to manage conflict and criticism better, right? Because when you understand that strengths are in play and that not everybody is equally strong at the same things, like a lot of times you end up taking offense to criticism that you get because you say, I would have never positioned it that way. I would have never said it that way. I could have thought of a million more productive ways of conveying the same point, right? And you just sit there in that discontentment. But at the end of the day, you can't do much about it. And at the end of the day, you still have to have feedback. You still have to tell that person the impact of what they said and how it could have been received better, right? It doesn't absolve you from that, but it helps you to kind of like defuse that anger a little bit, because you're like, you recognize that maybe it's coming from a place of deficiency. Maybe there's something that's easy for me that's not easy for them. And they didn't see, like, as obvious as it feels to me that this would have been the best way to approach giving that feedback, to them that was not obvious because they have other strengths, right? And maybe the way that they chose to communicate plays into one of their strengths, right? So it's an opportunity. Like the best feedback I've ever given is when you can affirm a strength, but still provide correction, right? Like, so for instance, it's like, if you didn't agree with the way that something was delivered, like you could say like, hey, what I really appreciate about you is I know that you have this, maximizer strength where you are always going for the best quality product possible. When you gave me this feedback on the deliverable, like, let me tell you how that impacted me. I told you that this was a preliminary deliverable. I wasn't engineering this to 100% quality. And it's my personal feeling that an 80% threshold for this first pass is enough, right? And so when you gave me that feedback, it made me feel like we were miscalibrated and taking this from a couple of different perspectives. And honestly, like I felt like you were casting judgment on my ability when these were conscious choices on my part and not an ability deficiency at all, right? That's a much more productive conversation then like, man, what you said to me in that meeting was super fucked up and hurt my feelings. You know what I'm saying? So anyway, like I think in my best moments, that knowledge that we don't all have the same strengths and perspectives helps me to process conflict more productively.
When it sounds like it's helped you create space between the way you respond and the action you take and the other person, which is, I mean, a huge management skill that often people can go their whole career and never know how to do that effectively. And so they just fire at all cylinders constantly, you know, slowly or quickly eroding the culture. Whereas you're saying you've got to take a step back long enough to see that not everybody's going to have the same strengths you do. Not everyone's going to have the same profile you do. It's going to look different, and we need to be patient, you know, in our hearts and minds with folks. And I think you do a great job of that. I've worked for you before and created presentations, and you've given me feedback, and it's never felt punitive. It's felt encouraging. And then I've been able to just say, hey, I'm just going to be really honest. This stuff right here, I'm not real good at. I'm going to need your help. And you've been able to lean in and support me in that way. So I think that's wonderful. I'm curious, you know, we talk about work, and how does this impact your personal life? You talked about, you know, your guitar situation, and Monica and all of us, for the record, around us, validating that, yes, you should purchase the guitar and not feel guilty. But how would you say it shows up in your personal life?
Yeah, that's a solid example. I think, you know, that story I told about just assuming that eventually if we worked on our weaknesses enough, we would all arrive at a similar place. And that was like the path to harmony and unity in the world, right? I no longer think that. But I did think that early in my marriage, you know, I did think that, you know, and like, yeah. And like, that was just so naive because like, I didn't realize just the enormity of the differences between Monica, my partner, and I, you know, at the time. Like we had very different cultural upbringings, like very different geographic upbringings, very different values center upbringings. And, you know, there were just things that I had been taught and reinforced were like correct, like in the household that I was growing up in, that I just kind of like carried with me into our relationship. And it, like, you know, one of the things I say in customer experience consulting a lot is that dissatisfaction exists in the gap between experience and expectation, right? Like, and that's true of literally anything, including your marriage. Like if you enter your marriage with expectations that are unvoiced about the way that they will show up and process things and communicate, and your experience doesn't line up with that, then you're going to be dissatisfied. But like, between experience and expectation, what is the one thing you can control? It's expectation, right? So what StrengthsFinder has really helped me to do is reframe my expectations with more grace and generosity, because not only did I realize that our strengths are different, but I also realized that I have weaknesses. I have a bottom 5. I have a bottom 10. She has a bottom 5. She has a bottom 10. And sometimes things in my top 10 are in her bottom 10. And that's what makes us great together. It's also where things feel the most frustrating, you know? But Sarah, I love the example that you gave about, you know, us working together in the past and like me giving you feedback and you feeling comfortable enough to say, hey, this isn't the thing I'm the strongest at. I need your help. And it's this reciprocal relationship.
Right.
You know? And I think that is the litmus test of trust, right? And that is the litmus test of the power of what StrengthsFinder can do, is when you can say, without any impact to your own self-worth or your own self-esteem, Scott, you're much better at this than I am. I need your help here. And Sarah, there's a host of things where I would not touch them with a 10-foot pole, but I would go to you because for you, you just turn it around in an hour, and I think like that's the power of Strengths Finder. So I've definitely seen it in my marriage. I've also seen it in how we treat our kids, I think like my son is hyperverbal, super intelligent, ADHD, and is attitudinally and behaviorally not as compliant as my little girl, and the way that we coach and develop and mentor them is very different. We meet them where they're at, and it's not because we have different expectations. Like we have an expectation that they pursue something in life that marries their strengths, their motivations, and what the world needs. Right. And we both fully expect that they can make a living at it, right? And that they will be successful at it. And we know that their paths are going to look completely different from each other. And that's okay. Versus I think there are a lot of parents out there who would be like, regardless of how many kids we have, y'all are getting straight A's, you're doing extracurriculars, you're going to college, you're getting a degree, like it's one of these 10 colleges is acceptable, right? And then you're going to get one of these 5 different careers. And that's just not an expectation that we have for our kids because we're still learning who they are and they're learning who they are. Right.
Well, and what a beautiful approach, because it sounds like you're going full circle from the way you were raised to the way you're consciously choosing to raise your own children. Well, Scott, we really appreciate you sharing your top 5s and really the impact that this has had. Both in your work and your personal life. Again, I think that vulnerability is such a strength of yours, and it builds courage and trust, and really just is incredible. So, Scott, thank you. And after listening to today's podcast, if you're interested in pursuing career or performance coaching for yourself or bringing leadership development training to your organization, reach out to us. info@workplacetherapy.net or info@unityandcompany.com. We'd love to be able to see how we can support you. Thanks for listening, and we'll see you next time for another session of Workplace Therapy.